Good morning, everyone. I am Gustavo Alegret. I am a journalist and I work for the international news channel NTN24. And I would like to welcome everyone to the third and last day of the 24th Annual CAF Conference. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to everyone and a special thanks to our media partners, El País, América Economía, and NTN24. We are going to jump right into our first session of the day. Pandemic politics, impact on democracy, and rule of law in Latin America. Remember to participate in the conversation using our conference hashtag, Diálogo CAF 2020. This panel will be moderated by Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Michael is a John Professor of Latin American Politics at Georgetown University. He previously directed the Latin American and Caribbean program at the National Endowment for Democracy and the Force Foundation's Governance and Human Rights program. Since 1994, he has played a key role in shaping the dialogue's agenda, commissioning policy-relevant articles and reports. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael and the astonishing speakers of this panel.
Gracias, Gustavo, y buenos días, buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Thank you, Gustavo, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm very pleased to extend a welcome to all the participants of this annual CAF conference. I am grateful for the trust of CAF and the strong partnership it has with the dialogue. I wanted to thank all of the speakers from yesterday and Wednesday for your very insightful discussion. I also wanted to thank the dialogue and the excellent work of Sofia and Denise Yanovich. This session will be conducted in Spanish. All of the panelists speak perfect Spanish, with the exception of the moderator. Today is September 11th. This is a very important date in the history of Chile with the coup and in the United States because of the terrorist attacks, but also important for democracy in Latin America with the signing of the Democratic Charter in Lima, Peru. In the beginning of the conference, we heard perspectives from specialists about the magnitude and the seriousness of the social impact and economic impact of COVID-19. Latin America is suffering setbacks. We have seen the alarming figures. This morning, we're going to be exploring the political impacts, the impact on rule of law and democracy coming from the pandemic. This is something that is key and complex, and it has led to a great deal of debate and discussion. Happily, a panel, I am going to be presenting them in the order in which they will be speaking. We have Kevin Casas Zamorda, who is from IDEA International, which supports democracy throughout the world. He used to be the second vice president of Costa Rica. He is currently a senior fellow, non-resident in the dialogue, and worked at the Organization of American States. Then we have Monica de Boyer, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a former director of Latin American Studies in emerging markets of size of Johns Hopkins Universities. In 2014, she was named a standout economist in Brazil for her contributions to economic policy in Brazil. Jorge Castañeda was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Mexico from 2000 to 2003. He is currently a professor at New York University. Besides being a regular columnist in the journal Nexos, the New York Times, and El País, he has written more than 15 books that have been published in the United States and worldwide. The last is titled The United States in in intimacy and at a distance. It's very important for helping me to understand my own country in these crucial and complex times. We also have Lucia Damert, who is a professor of international relations of the University of Santiago, Chile. She is also part of the Wilson Center. She is a specialized researcher on urban violence, police reform, and organized crime in Latin America. She has been an advisor in multilateral and national organizations and is a member of the Advisory Commission at the United Nations. And then we have Luz Mele Reyes, who is a journalist and political analyst. She is a co-founder and director general of Efecto Cocuyo. This is an independent digital news outlet in Caracas. They cover matters of Venezuelan migration, and this is a platform for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. In 2018, she received an international award in freedom of the press, which was granted for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Before moving on to the panel, I think it's important to recall the state of democracy pre-COVID-19. Last night, I was looking at the video on the session about this very topic just 1 year ago, September of 2019. I was struck by the very pessimistic tone taken during that session. A number of experts talked about the malaise, according to Latino Barometer, about the levels of dissatisfaction with democracy. These were discussions of political leaders that we heard in the months subsequent to the conference in places like Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, and the street protests. Mexico and Brazil have also experienced changes, and we're going to hear about that today. We see some matters for concern. In view of the pandemic, it's important to counter authoritarian trends. We're seeing growing demand for more competent governments. We're going to see what path the region takes in the coming years. So let's start with Kevin. As we know, he comes from a very diverse country. You have a regional and a global perspective and a great deal of experience about this topic. What impact do you believe COVID has had thus far in the region, and how do you see the political future? And what have we learned in 6 months of the pandemic in terms of the left, the right, in terms of understanding of society and the capacity to respond to such a large shock? And finally, what concerns do you have about the upcoming elections, which is something that you discussed in a New York Times column? Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you to the dialogue, to CAF, to the OAS, all of their affiliated organizations. The truth is, I'm very pleased to be a part of this panel and share it with several friends. You're asking me about the impact that the current crisis might have on the future politics of Latin America. The short, boring, and true answer is that we still don't know. We don't know what the impacts are going to be yet. The truth is, I have no obligation to be entertaining here. This is not a single crisis. It is a cascade of crises that we're going to see unfolding over an extended period. But like at the individual level, at the level of countries, this crisis is hitting harder those who have pre-existing conditions, and that is the case of Latin America. So what do I mean by pre-existing conditions? We have the most unequal societies in the world. And if I talk about political conditions, we have very low levels of trust in our institutions. And we know that this is really important when it comes to tackling the crisis. High levels of fragmentation in the party systems, greater and greater polarization, and states with very limited capabilities. We have some nations with very precarious fiscal environments. Public debt in Latin America is approximately 70% of GDP. So the ability to throw money at the crisis to respond to it with fiscal resources is very limited. And this is above all when it comes to public health. I had an interesting discussion recently talking about differences between Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. There are a number of reasons why sub-Saharan Africa has done relatively well and Latin America has done relatively poorly with this crisis. Some of the conditions are more favorable, they're younger population, but sub-Saharan Africa, unlike Latin America, has installed capacity to tackle epidemics because they've had 40 years of experience dealing with HIV and Ebola. And there's very little experience like that in Latin America. So we have states with limited capabilities. These are some of the pre-existing conditions that in part explain why the crisis is having such an impact on Latin America. Now, we have seen a widespread invoking of a state of emergency. Practically all countries in the region have declared states of emergency, and it's totally legitimate for democracies to do that in special circumstances. But in the case of Latin America, we're seeing some of these states of emergency last longer than anywhere else in the world. In Argentina, just 2 countries in the region have lifted their states of emergency. There's an overuse of punitive responses to the pandemic. Some countries are detaining people. We have one of the longest lockdowns in the world. Argentina, I think, has had the longest lockdown worldwide. Despite this, I think emergency powers are not my main concern as we talk about the impact on democracy. I believe that constitutional courts in the region are going to play a very, very important role. So come back and ask me the same question a year from now, and we'll look at the matter of emergency powers. Perhaps the most problematic case in terms of the exercise of exceptional powers is the case of El Salvador, where we've seen an authoritarian turn that's very dangerous and a struggle between the branches of government and the checks and balances. This has exacerbated conflicts in the framework of this crisis. Now, there's a second category of crises. And now we're talking about elections here. COVID clearly has had an impact on election calendars. There are 12 different countries that are postponing elections in one way or another, presidential elections. We saw the case of Bolivia, and they're supposedly not moving that. The Dominican Republic as well. The case is Latin America is going to have 9 presidential elections in coming 24 months, and many of these will be held in conditions defined by the pandemic. One noteworthy issue here is the weakness in Latin America of special mechanisms for casting a vote. For example, mail-in voting, early voting, an extension of election days. There's not a single country in Latin America that allows mail-in voting. Not a single one that allows to an extended voting day. And the reason for this weakness in mechanism is because there's a terrible lack of trust in election authorities in Latin America. Now, in terms of special mechanisms for casting a vote, which have been key, for example, in places like South Korea, this is something that we see in terms of election participation. In Dominican Republic, those voting rates fell 14% vis-a-vis the previous elections. This brings me to something key. Looking forward, the successful holding of elections, like so many other things, depends on the level of control over the virus. It is very difficult that participation in elections if infection rates are going up. In South Korea, the reason it wasn't impacted is because they had stabilized their cases just a month earlier, but in France and other places. So controlling the virus is extremely important, and to have successful elections to ensure that this happens in Latin America is key, because in some cases, this is the only escape valve for political systems that are under great pressure. And I'll wrap up with my next idea. What I'm most concerned about in terms of political impacts are those that come from the huge economic crisis the region is up against. This is something that is just beginning. As a consequence of the economic crisis, we're going to see political instability. We're going to see law enforcement issues, looting, for example. And then the option of prolonging emergency powers is going to seem more attractive. And I believe almost surely that the armed forces will play a greater role. There are places in the region, Chile, etc., that have used the military to exercise these emergency powers. So if we're going to shed light on the political impacts here, to understand this fully is going to take a great deal of time. 3 or 4 months ago, we were all saying, and I include myself here, okay, the countries that are going to do well here are the ones that already had robust institutions. Okay, fine. That the success in Uruguay in facing the pandemic was predicted, but not Paraguay. Why Paraguay and not Chile, for example? Costa Rica has robust institutions and it started off well, and now it's a disaster. So we know very little. There are too many factors at play here that have an impact on how successful a country is. And very humbly, I do not want to make specific judgments. Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was excellent. Let's move on to the 4 specific cases. Each has its own characteristics. So let's start with the biggest country, Brazil. Monica, based on reports that we have, the management by President Bolsonaro of the pandemic has perhaps been the worst in the region, or it's getting the worst press and the worst scores. But we've seen an increase in recent months. It would seem that it's possible that he will win a second term in 2022. So how can this be explained? Is it because of payments made by the government? Is it because of weaknesses, division? What other factors? Mónica?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Michael. Es un placer para mí estar aquí de nuevo.
I'm very
Y
pleased
bueno,
to be
va a
here
ser
once
en
again.
portuñol porque es así
This
que
is going to
hablo,
be a bit of
pero
portuñol
siempre intentando hacerme entender por ustedes.
because I hope that you can all
Me gustaría mucho de
understand me.
agradecer también a CAF,
I would
al
like to
diálogo
thank
y a OEA
CAF and the
por
dialogue,
por
as
este
well as
evento
the
que siempre es tan
OAS,
importante.
for this
Y
event that
como
is always
decías al
so
inicio, cuando
important.
miramos así
As you
nuestras
were saying at the
participaciones en
outset,
eventos
when
anteriores
we look
anuales,
at
vemos
our
como las cosas
participation
que
in previous
decimos
annual
están
conferences,
siempre
we
a
see
empeorar
what
un
we
poco
were saying then,
de
and
aquel
then we see
escenario
the
que
way they
nosotros
evolve.
pensamos. Bueno, la
And
pandemia es
we're in
una
a
cosa
scenario that
excepcional,
we
pero
never
mismo así,
envisioned. This is an
así son
exceptional
son
case,
las
but even
cosas.
so, it tends
La cuestión
to
de
work out
Bolsonaro
that
en
way.
Brasil es muy interesante
Bolsonaro
y
in Brazil. This is a very interesting topic, but at the same time, it is also very
es el peor
concerning.
manejo de la
It is
pandemia
the worst management of the pandemic
sin duda,
in the region, undoubtedly, and the numbers tell us that.
Que tener es que hay muchísima
what you have to understand is that there's a lot of under-notification, under-reporting of both deaths and cases. Brazil has more than
poco más de
4 million
130,000
cases and a bit more than 130,000 deaths.
Enorme
but
en
there
los datos. Entonces,
is
peor,
underreporting of the data, which so the scenario is ultimately worse than those official figures. We're only behind the United States in terms of the number of deaths. The country, however,
Entonces, las
is
cosas todas
acting
están
as if the
abiertas,
epidemic
la
has
economía
disappeared.
está
Everything's
abierta, por
open.
así decir.
The
Eso
economy
no quiere
is
decir que las
open
cosas
for
estén
business
funcionando
in a manner of
normalmente.
speaking.
Las escuelas siguen
Doesn't mean
cerradas
that
y hay un
things are
debate
working
muy
as before. Schools are
acalentado,
closed, and there's a
político
very
y
heated
ideologizado,
political
porque todo en
debate
Brasil está
about this because
ideologizado en este momento,
and everything
sobre la
has been
apertura de las escuelas
is
y
fraught with
teniendo en cuenta
ideology
que
in
así como
Brazil.
en otros países
And
de la
bearing in
región
mind
y
that in
así como
other
aquí en
countries in
Estados
the
Unidos,
region,
las escuelas cerradas son un problema
like in the
serísimo
United
desde el punto
States,
de vista de
closed
distribución
schools
de renta,
is
porque,
very difficult
hay un
in
montón
terms of income distribution. It relies
niños
heavily on that.
que
There are
solo se
many
alimentan en las
children
escuelas y
who only
necesitan de las
eat when they
escuelas
go to
para que
school. They
sus
need the
padres
schools.
puedan trabajar. Entonces es
They
una
need to go to
situación
school so that their
bastante
parents
complicada
can work.
esa,
It's
que
a
está
very
contribuyendo
complex
hasta
situation.
tiempo a
And
los otros
this is
problemas que
something
vemos en
that for
Brasil, pero
many
con la
years now
epidemia en la
has
situación
been
que
a
está,
factor in
no
all
hay
of the other
cómo
problems.
abrir
But with
las
the
escuelas.
epidemic,
Entonces este es
there
un
is
problema
absolutely
gravísimo
no
y que no
way to
sabemos
open the
cómo se
schools.
va
This is a
a
very
resolver.
serious problem, and
Pero
we
en
do
lo que me
not know
preguntaba
how
acerca
this is
de
going to be
Bolsonaro,
resolved.
lo que se ha
But
visto
specifically
es
about
que él ha
Bolsonaro,
ganado la
what we've
narrativa.
seen
Entonces,
is
la
he
narrativa
has
de
won
inicio
the narrative.
siempre fue
The initial
que
narrative was
este no era
always
un problema muy grave,
that this was
que
not a
el
very
virus no era
serious
grave, que el
problem, that the
virus era
virus
como
wasn't
que
serious,
un pequeño flu,
that it was like
así algo que no se
a flu,
debería
not
preocupar tanto.
anything
Y
that
el
people should be
presidente,
overly
por
concerned
cierto,
about.
acreditaba en eso porque siempre
And
dice esto,
the
continúa a
president
decirlo. Así que los
has
meses han
said that
pasado,
from the
las
start.
muertes
He
han
continues to
aumentado, los
say it.
casos han
We've
aumentado y
seen
él
the case numbers
diciendo la
skyrocket,
misma
the
cosa.
death skyrocket,
Y
and he
la
hasn't
situación
changed his narrative at all.
de muy mala en la economía, junto con la fatiga de la
Very
población
bad
con
economic
medidas de salud
situation
pública. En
together
Brasil no ha jamás
with
tenido un lockdown.
health
se ponga
with
esto en la
public
mesa,
health
porque
measures.
hay
And by the
muchas
way, there was
ideas
never
ahí
a
de que
lockdown in
hubo
Brazil.
lockdowns en
There were
unas partes del
many
país
places that
y
were said,
cosas
oh,
así,
there
pero
was
la verdad es
lockdown
que
in
no.
parts of the country.
Hubo
No, but the truth
lockdowns
is that is not
en
the
la
case.
ciudad de São
There were
Paulo, hubo
lockdowns
lockdowns un poco en la
in
ciudad de
Sao
Río,
Paulo and a
pero
little
en la
bit maybe in
realidad
Rio.
la
But
población que se ha quedado
truth
en
be
casa
told,
era
those who
sobre
stayed
todo la
home
población que tiene
were
renta alta.
above all
Entonces, las
high
personas que tenían
income
que salir para trabajar,
individuals.
estas
People who
personas
had
salieron
to
para
leave
trabajar
home
si
to
los
go work,
establecimientos
they
estuvieran abiertos.
kept
Los
working
restaurantes,
as
bares,
long as
cosas
the
así,
place that they
estuvieron
worked were still
cerrados
open.
por un tiempo,
Restaurants and
pero
bars
hace
were closed for a
algunas
short
veces
time,
empezó a abrirlos
but
y
several months ago
entonces
they
tenemos
began
esta
to reopen.
situación de una epidemia descontrolada porque no
So
se ha jamás tenido
we have this case of
la
a
intención
completely
de
uncontrolled
hacer algo,
pandemic
una
because there was
estrategia
never
clara
any
para
intention
controlar la
take on a
diseminación
specific
del virus.
strategy to
Entonces, en la
deal with the
economía,
virus.
en las cuestiones de salud pública, estamos de
When it
cierta
comes
manera
to
en lo
public
peor
health,
de los mundos, porque
we are
continúa el
in the
descontrol
worst
y
case
por otro
scenario.
lado la economía no está bien,
Nothing is under
el PIB
control. The
cayó lo
economy
máximo
is
que
not doing well.
jamás
The
ha
GDP
caído en la
fell
historia de
the
Brasil.
most
En el
it's
segundo
ever
trimestre
fallen
estamos con
in the second
una especie de
quarter than
depresión
ever in history.
económica y
So
las
we're in a
cosas
sort
siguen
of
así.
economic
Pero
depression
como
and
decía,
things
la
continue to roll
narrativa
along
y la
like that.
manera como
But as I was
Bolsonaro
saying, the
ha
narrative
pasado de
and the
crisis
way
en crisis,
that
porque la manera
Bolsonaro has just
como
gone from
actúa
crisis to crisis,
políticamente, y esto
the
va
way
a
he is
sonar
acting
muchísimo
politically
familiar para los que
is
nos
going to sound very
acompañan aquí y que
familiar
tienen
to many
una
of you who are
relación
joining us
muy
here
directa con los Estados
because
Unidos
it
como
has a
nosotros,
very
Michael.
direct relationship
Entonces
with
es
the United
familiar lo que
States.
pasa. Bolsonaro es un
It's
tipo
familiar
que
what's
vive de
happening.
crisis
Bolsonaro
y que vive de
is a
caos.
guy who
Entonces
lives
para él,
from
cuanto
crisis
más
and
caos,
chaos.
cuanto más
For
crisis,
him, the
mejor.
more chaos,
Y
the more
así
crisis, the
se ha
better.
hecho las cosas, porque el
And
país
this
está
is the
muchísimo
way things have
polarizado,
done because the
la
country is
izquierda y la
very
oposición están
polarized.
completamente,
The left and the
no hay
opposition.
una oposición,
Well,
por
let's just say
cierto,
that there's
arreglada,
no
entonces es cada uno por uno,
structured
están
opposition.
así como
Everyone's on their
sueltos,
own,
sin una estrategia
kind
en
of off on
común,
their own,
sin
without
una
any common
visión en común,
strategy,
sin
without any
argumentos
shared
para
vision, without
contrastar lo que está pasando
arguments
en
to
Brasil y lo que
counter what's
podría
happening in
estar
Brazil
pasando si la
and what
situación
could be
estuviera en
happening
otro
if
patamar.
the situation
Entonces, no
were
hay un
happening
discurso de la
elsewhere.
oposición que se
There's
pueda
no
hacer
discourse from the
una especie
opposition
de
that
otro
could
lado, de visión del
serve
otro lado de las
as
cuestiones.
a
Con esto
counterweight
Bolsonaro
to
está
the
yendo
discourse of
muy
the
bien
president.
y
And so things
está
are
yendo
going
muy
great
bien
for
en las
Bolsonaro.
encuestas, se ve en las
Everything's
encuestas de
going well
opinión
in the
y no es
polls.
solo una cuestión del
It's not
llamado
just
auxilio
a
emergencial,
matter
que es
of
este programa de
emergency
transferencia
support,
de recursos
which is
para la
a
población
cash
más
transfer
vulnerable.
program for the
Entonces,
most
esto se ha hecho en
vulnerable
Brasil en abril.
population. This is
Fue
something that was
esfuerzo
created
de
in
la
April,
sociedad en conjunto con el
and it
Congreso.
was a
El
response
Congreso aprobó
from
muy
society together with the
rápidamente
Congress.
este
Congress
auxilio para
very
las
quickly
familias y para las
approved
personas
this aid
en condiciones de
for families
vulnerabilidad.
and for
De inicio,
people in vulnerable
la visión
situations.
era que las personas que
And
iban a recibir este
the
beneficio
idea is
eran
that
las
people who were
personas de
going to
renta
be
más baja,
receiving
los
this
informales,
were
la gente
the
que
lowest income
trabaja
people,
por
people
cuenta
with
propia,
informal
pero la gente que
employment,
trabaja
the
por cuenta
self-employed,
propia en
but
Brasil es como en
those
el
who are
resto de la
self-employed in
región y
Brazil
diferente de los
is
Estados Unidos.
very
Es
different
gente que
from the way
trabaja
it is
para
in the United States.
ganar
These are people
un
who
salario a cada día.
work
Entonces son
on a
personas que
day-to-day
trabajan por
basis.
día.
So
Es una situación
it's
de
like
trabajo
day
muchísimo
workers. So
precaria.
it's
Y
very
ahí se tenía una
precarious work.
estimativa de que
And there were
50
estimates
mil
that
millones de personas más o
about
menos iban a recibir el
50 billion
beneficio. Al
people were
final,
going to
el
50 million
gobierno, que
people were
estaba
going
todo
to
el
receive this
tiempo
benefit,
contrario
but the
al beneficio
government
emergencial, se ha puesto en el
opposed
último momento a
this. The
favor. Y
administration did at the
después,
very last
mismo
minute
que
decided to
han
support
tenido
it.
problemas de
And
ejecución, el
as
gobierno
they
lo vio
had
claramente
problems,
los
the
ganos
government saw
políticos de este
very
programa y
clearly
entonces
the political
amplió el
gains from the
programa
program.
y ahora
So
tenemos
decided
cerca
to
de
broaden
casi
it, and now
mitad
we
de la
have
población
almost
brasileña que
half
está
of
recibiendo
Brazil's
este beneficio. Son
population receiving
100
these
mil
benefits.
millones de personas casi. Entonces es un montón de gente.
100 million
Es un
people.
programa que
It's
cuesta
a
mucho
lot of
a
people.
las cuentas públicas.
It's
Es
a
un programa caro,
program that's being paid
pero
for
es un
from
programa que
the
claramente
public
ha beneficiado a la población.
treasury. It's
Entonces ha sido
very
muy
expensive. It
importante.
has
Pero al
helped the
mismo tiempo,
population. It's been
el
very
gobierno y
important. But
Bolsonaro,
at the
con la
same
ausencia de
time,
la
both
oposición en
Bolsonaro
el
and the
debate,
government,
Bolsonaro
given
ha,
that the opposition
de
is
cierta
absent
manera,
from the debate,
tomado
Bolsonaro
para
has
sí mismo
taken this
todo
for
lo que dice
himself
respecto a este programa.
and everything
Entonces la
said
población
about this
pasó a
program.
asociar
So
el
the
auxilio
population
emergencial con la
has
figura del
associated
presidente,
this
mismo que el
assistance with the
presidente tenga
president,
sido contrario al
and
programa al
even though the
inicio.
president
Y
opposed
esto
it at the
sí
very
ha tenido un
beginning. And
reflejo
this
grande
has
en las encuestas de opinión,
had
en
an
sus niveles de
impact
aprobación.
on opinion
Y es como
polls and
decía, para
approval
la
levels.
población en Brasil
And
no
for the
hay una
population in
asociación
Brazil,
directa
there
con las
is not
medidas
a
del
direct
gobierno, las
association
malas
with
medidas del
government
gobierno
measures, the
en términos de
bad
la contención
measures
de la
that the
pandemia, con
administration has
la
implemented
identificación de esto
or
con
hasn't to
Bolsonaro. Esto
contain this
prácticamente no
with
existe.
Bolsonaro.
Entonces lo
This is
que
something that practically
existe
did
es,
not exist.
hay
So
un
what
virus en
does
circulación,
exist
todos
is
lo
that there
entienden,
is a
saben que es
virus.
peligroso,
Everyone
pero
knows this. They know it's
la visión
dangerous.
es que, bueno, las cosas
However,
tienen
the
que
vision
funcionar
is
y
that
entonces no se
things
puede hablar
have
mucho
to
de
run their
lockdowns y de cosas
course,
así. Entonces,
and you
de
just
una
can't talk,
cierta manera,
can't make
hay
any
una
changes,
visión de
and
que
to a
el
certain
presidente
degree,
estaba
there's a
cierto desde el
vision that
inicio
the
y que
president was
ahora
right from the very
él ha hecho
beginning,
este auxilio
and
emergencial y que esto
now
ha sido bueno para
he,
mucha gente.
what he's done
Entonces,
has
para
been
una
good for
gran
many
parte de la
people.
población
So for
brasileña
a large
hay una
part of Brazil's
sensación así
population,
no de
there is this
conforto, no,
sensation,
es una
not
situación de
not of
incertidumbre
comfort.
absoluta,
Of course,
pero
there
no
is absolute
existe
uncertainty,
nada que se ponga
but
como
there's
alternativa
no
a
alternative
Bolsonaro en
on the
este momento.
table to
Y todas las
Bolsonaro right now.
discusiones que estamos
And
teniendo en
all
el
of the
país, entonces, por
discussions that we're
ejemplo,
having in the
yo estoy muy
country,
involucrada en
for
la
example,
discusión
I'm
sobre
very
la
involved in
introducción
the
de un programa de
discussion
renta
about
básica
introducing
permanente en el país.
a permanent
Y
basic
cuando eso
income program in
empezó,
the
hace
country.
unos 2, 3
And when this
meses,
began, just 2 or 3
rápidamente el
months ago,
gobierno
very
se apropió de
quickly,
nuevo del
the
debate y
government
ha una
took
vez más
control of the
puesto en la
debate, and
mesa
one more
una
time
propuesta que no hay
put out
contenido,
on
no
the
hay
table a
contenido alguno,
proposal,
pero es
and
una
there's no
propuesta de renta
content to
básica.
it.
Entonces, ellos mismos, que antes
And
eran
so
contrarios a este tipo de programas de
they
renta básica
have
permanente o renta básica
opposed these
universal,
basic
están
minimum
ahora
income
hablando de renta
programs,
básica universal y
but
renta
now they're
básica
talking
permanente.
about universal
Entonces,
basic
y de
income.
nuevo, hay un
And once
espacio
again,
en abierto en la oposición.
and
Entonces,
there is
lo
no
que veo ahora,
opposition
y
in
todo puede
place.
cambiar, porque
So what
claramente
I'm
es
seeing
América
now
Latina, es Brasil,
in
todo
Latin
cambia
America
todo
and
el tiempo
Brazil, everything is
y siempre hay
changing all
algo
the
que no
time,
esperamos que
and there's
aparece,
always
pero
something
viendo la
that is
situación de ahora
unexpected, but
hasta
considering the situation now,
2022, que
looking
es cuando
forward to
nosotros vamos a tener
2022, which is
elecciones
when we
presidenciales,
will have
por
presidential
ahora el camino
elections.
está
For the
abierto para
moment,
Bolsonaro,
the path is
completamente
open for
abierto.
Bolsonaro,
Y esto es un
completely
problema,
open.
porque en términos
This
de
is a
democracia,
problem because in
Bolsonaro en
terms
estos
of
meses, el
democracy,
año pasado, como
Bolsonaro,
asumió la presidencia, pero
when
también
he took
estos meses todos durante la pandemia,
office,
ha hecho
and
un
this has
montón de
happened throughout the
declaraciones que son
pandemic,
contrarias
he's
a
made
las
many
instituciones, que
statements
son contrarias a la
against the
democracia, ha
institutions
hecho cosas que son
and
contrarias a la
has
democracia
done
y se ha
things
puesto
that are
claramente como un
against
líder populista y
democracy,
autoritario. Pero
that are
esto no
populist
está
and
teniendo reflejos
authoritarian.
en los sentimientos de la
But
población.
we don't see this
Entonces, es como digo,
reflected.
el camino está abierto y estamos
The
ahí
path is
con un
open,
problema serísimo por la frente en la mayor
and
economía de la
we're
región.
seeing this in the greatest economy. Thank you, Monica. Now we are going to go to Jorge, who is much more optimistic. I'm just kidding. In the case of Bolsonaro, as Monica and Jorge and AMLO and the response to COVID. Unlike Brazil, there is little effort to help the poor, and the economy is worse than ever. The only success is to have friendly relations, and there is a high level of approval ratings. His approval ratings are relatively high. It's charisma, corruption in previous administrations, or it's like Brazil, where there is no opposition, there's no organized opposition. So I would like to comment a bit.
Jorge, you have the floor. Thank you, Michael. And I thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference, of course. And as you mentioned, I remember that it's been 19 years since the Inter-American Democratic Charter was signed. I was one of the fortunate or unfortunate that signed on that day, and I only lament that it coincided with the attacks, and that charter did not have the luck that we all wished for on that day. In the first place, I believe, Michael, that we must remember that López Obrador has about the same rate of approval that Fox and Calderón, his predecessors, had at the same time of their term. So it is nothing exceptional in terms of Mexican approval. I think Peña Nieto, who was way below Fox, Calderón, and AMLO. That's the first point I think I want to underscore. The second point is that the same general elections that are about 55, 66, 57% are very good under any criteria, but it is the same as his predecessors. So those same polls say that the people are more critical of the public policies, because one thing is the approval of the actual person. People still like him, respect him. They believe him less than before, but they still believe him. However, if you ask people, do you approve how he has managed the pandemic, the economy, poverty, safety, security, everything except education? In everything except education, there is more criticism than positive reactions. So here there is a contradiction that will at some point explode. Either the government increases the approval of its policies, or the ratings for him personally will come down. Why? Because objective results are catastrophic. In all countries in the world, the numbers are underestimating the number of people dead from the pandemic, and this is excessively so in Mexico, because The Economist, the New York Times, El País, Nexus magazine have been calculating every 2 or 3 weeks, every month, the number of excess deaths according to death certificates in the accounts. So this compared to previous years, and this calculation has been done for Mexico, and the government itself is doing it, because it is the government that provides the data on deaths, on excess deaths. So today, instead of the 77,000 official deaths, we are at about 200,000 deaths, real deaths, measured in that manner with official data. If we compare that with the population of and other countries, Mexico is the country with the most deaths per 100,000 people in the world, and by far. Even though on top of the government and myself saying it, The Economist has a ranking every 2 or 3 weeks of deaths per 100,000 compared to previous years. And Mexico City is the first in the world in number of deaths. The results for López Obrador are catastrophic in this area, undoubtedly, no discussion. Secondly, the economy, and we spoke of this in the case of Mexico, but just to reiterate in a very brief manner, we will fall within the third least growth economy in Latin America. The economy will fall by many percentage points, and no, there are other countries that will fall this way, but there will be other countries in Latin America that will have less decrease in this, and to help people that do not have jobs or lost their income. So there is no insurance for unemployment in Mexico, not before and not now. What is happening is that the social effect of that economic fall or decrease is dramatic, perhaps more so than in other Latin American countries, because there is no fiscal effort to help the people. So these are the two concrete results. The third one that you mentioned, Michael, which is violence, continues to be higher than in the worst years of Calderón and Peña Nieto, as far as homicides per 100,000 people. We're still above any other number in Mexico in its history, and even above Brazil, as the French would say. It's difficult to do. Not anyone kills more than the Brazilians, but we do, and we do it happily, enthusiastically. People are suffering this, and they're suffering a lot. There is no spectacular growth, but there is an increase month by month of this. So what will happen with all of this? Well, in the first place, what has been surviving, because he has been surviving because of corruption. People voted for him and expected of him to truly launch a crusade against corruption. So against corruption in his government, and that's debatable, but it shows that even though perhaps there isn't the same amount of corruption within the cabinet as there was with Peña Nieto, corruption is still there. And other reasons, because salaries for public employees, medium-level public employees, have decreased, have fallen. So those have been reduced. And the private health insurance, they have taken away cell phones given by the government. Perhaps that's not so important, but it counts for some people. And that inevitably is an incentive towards corruption. So if you think that you're going to be there 1, 2, or 3 years because the cabinet rotation changeover has been very high, then you think to yourself, I'm going to be here 2 years. They're going to take 30% of my salary. You're going to take my savings. You're going to take my private health insurance, my car, my chauffeur. You take 20 things away from me, then I am going to take my vengeance by stealing. That's a very Mexican or maybe even healthy reaction. You shouldn't be horrified by this. I know that you, the Costa Ricans, are not this way, but yes, we have our very entrenched traditions, and this is one of them. So the problem with this crusade against corruption versus the previous government is that in Mexico, as we say, we have already been vaccinated against horror. People have seen too many times how a government places high public people in jail after their term finishes. So he was the first person to put Echeverria's people in jail. Everybody, every ex-president has done this, or political party. The new thing would be to place a president in jail, an ex-president. But that has not happened, and it is quite unlikely for it to happen, even though a scandal may exist in the media. And people, of course, are beginning to realize that it is not very likely that this would happen. So if you do some polls to see if they're being judged, and he loves to talk about all this every day, but it is very unlikely that Peña Nieto or Calderon will end up in jail. It's not easy to do. In the case of Peña, because he lives in Spain, and there would have to be some change over, and he'd have to go through Spanish justice. Or and the other ones, people remember Calderon because he fought against the drug traffickers. Well, some people did like that war. So let's see how long López Obrador's popularity will continue. His good relationship with Trump does help him. He has taken good care of it, and we'll see tomorrow, this is well known already, that Mexico will show up at the IDB meeting, and it is thanks to Mexico that the person that will be elected, that is sure to be elected as the new president. Let's see how long this will last and how long Trump will last. I think if Biden wins, obviously he'll have a good relationship with Mexico because that is mandatory for the US, but there will be a sweeter taste if Biden does win with López Obrador. It'll be a different situation. If all of this I am saying is true, and if the opposition parties find some way, even if it's tacitly, not a formal way or explicit, to ally state by state, district by district in some way and present a united front, even though it may not be a public coalition, I think Morena will lose the majority he has in the Chamber of Deputies, because the elections will only be, the next elections only for the lower chamber, not for the senators. Some are important, like Nuevo León. The others are smaller states. The state of Mexico doesn't participate in that one, not the city of Mexico, not Veracruz or Jalisco, but Nuevo León is an important state. And there it will be difficult. I don't know what will happen, but I think they could lose majority. And I think that for that reason, López Obrador is very nervous because he knows all this. He has all the figures. He reads all the polls. He understands and reads them very carefully. And he knows all of this. So he's very nervous because of this. And his authoritarian temptation, which has always existed, is manifesting itself more publicly. And threats against magazines, newspapers, civil society organizations, and individuals every day is growing and will continue to grow. Thank you, Michael. Perfect. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Jorge. Lucia, we will go to Chile. You have written and commented very acutely with the protests and violence on the streets in Chile of last year. And as a political class, right or left, the people could not understand the economic circumstances that many Chileans lived. So how do you explain the failure of this political class to design a strategy to lead during COVID-19? Do you think that preparing a new constitution or having a new constitution will lead to a more democratic society, or could it lead to more division within society? And do you think that more turbulence is inevitable in Chile or not? Lucia? Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue, OAS, and CAF for the invitation to be on this panel with such well-known people. Today is the 11th of September, and I cannot speak of Chile without remembering that on this date, 47 years ago, there was a coup d'etat. And it should remind us of what can happen when politics reaches a certain level of violation of human rights, rupture of democracy. So all the questions that have been asked, I will answer on the basis of three things. What has happened with the pandemic in Chile? It seemed that Chile was well organized, and as the majority of countries, it had its high moments, and then all of a sudden it became more concerning, and then into crisis, and now we're beginning to uptick and become more normal again. But there are some basic things regarding politics in Chile regarding COVID. First, the dichotomy between economy and public health was quite acute. This is tied to a second element, which does put pressure on the business side or private or the economic power spaces regarding their need to open the economy again, that you couldn't place on the scale health and then economy, because without economy, there was no health. But if we look at it correctly, it's the other way around. And the third point is that the government has had, and from the very beginning, the Minister of Health and the President do not listen or learn very well. Since we never face something that has been said here, a very variable, elusive crisis and difficult to face. However, the President and his First Minister of Health advanced as if they already had it solved, as if they knew, as if they identified everything. And of course, this began to fall each time that reality showed that the different public policies implemented did not work. So this is also tied to a fourth element that I think is basic, and that is that the communication from the government has been weak. Of course, we are in the situation after the social explosion that existed, but the government has been their position very complex. Today, we celebrate our national day, Independence Day, and there is a whole debate on how this will be celebrated. Will people go outside? Will they get together? Will it be 5 people celebrating or 15? And that may seem trivial, but it isn't. When the amount of people, and more than 60 people died yesterday, and the contagion is increasing. So everything that Monica was mentioning, where Bolsonaro takes over all the narrative, well, here what's happened is a lack of capacity to communicate, and a lot of uncertainty exists. And the fifth point that will be tied to this for these independence celebration, there are some from the middle left to the far right that were enamored of their model. I've seen other meetings like this one where the Chilean model was presented as the model that had solved all the Latin American problems. But the truth is that we belong to this club, and the social explosion demonstrated that that was not so. And the pandemic, the health minister said, a minister that was a minister 4 years ago, that he never really imagined the poverty and that existed in Chile. So this love for their model there has made it very difficult to try and face the pandemic in a more adequate manner. Another thing, this topic or debate of the new constitution, many people, because of the social crisis last year, decided to arrive at a political solution, which was to discuss creating a new constitution more open and that will lead us to a different social contract. And the pandemic has strengthened that because the constitution made and created by Pinochet, and then it was changed a bit, but it is still very strong, is a constitution that provides the government a subsidiary role to the private sector. So we cannot do this in health, public health. We cannot have this in other areas either. So I do believe that the Constitution, as you asked, Michael, does give us the opportunity to do something better. But, however, these processes can be seen by the society, hyper-bureaucratic process, an elitist process where things are being discussed that are not even tied to the day-to-day living. And finally, the possibility to discuss over 9 or 12 months and then this new constitution may be rejected, that already makes it problematic. So I think that is something that will last, at least in the debate, a long time in Chile. I hope the constitution allows for new voices to be part of it. But today, 2 months before the plebiscite for deciding whether people want this new constitution or not, something has not been solved that for me is fundamental. The role that the original people or indigenous people have to play, even though that is a basic subject for the definition of that new social contract. And within this framework, of course, this is my idea, even though I agree with Kevin, it is difficult to know what happened, but my idea is that the protests and manifestations, protests will continue in specific areas with different problems, from neighborhood protests to people that have lost their jobs. 9 of every 10 women that have stopped working are not looking for jobs. They have contracted their participation in labor because they're concerned of their children, their parents, and sometimes of their grandparents. So they have this emotional load to carry. And I think the protests will continue within the framework of the Constitution. If this process does become a Tower of Babel, it will become worse. And the magic is to generate participatory mechanisms where the citizenry can go and say, okay, let's have health be managed by the state and not just by the private sector. If this isn't solved, and these are all very complex situations where the protests, and I think this is important to mention, the protests are necessary. The problem is not to have them violent, but a country that has been politicized for 17 years, apart from the discussion, for all these people to begin express themselves and have this discussion, I think is positive. But what we have to do is not have them lead to violence, street violence, fires, etc. Because this has generated violations of human rights and a return to state violence that had not been seen for many years in Chile. And I think in that sense that Chile is facing a post-pandemic, whenever that is, that will be a very special situation in the region, and we should have our eye on what these protests mean for the region and this enormous politicization that could radicalize proposals, because many other countries are still, or many of the other countries are looking at Chile, and just as it was a model for the pension funds, and it could become a point of reference within the framework of protests, etc. Excellent. Thank you very much, Lucia. Luz. So we will now go to the more tragic thing in the region. It is well known that before the pandemic, the majority of Venezuelans found themselves in a desperate situation, and the pandemic has made this worse, the humanitarian crisis.
Perdimos a Michael, o yo no lo escucho.
Did we lose Michael?
Bueno, creo que perdimos a Michael.
Well, I think we lost Michael. I don't know if I could begin to participate. In any case, Venezuelans are used to all these things. The people that are directing the internet falls, so we are prepared for contingencies. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and hello to all my fellow panelists and the interpreters and the whole technical equipment that is part of this conference, this unparalleled one in the history of people that are joining.
I think now with the introduction that Michael had made about the context of Venezuela, it's important to identify how the pandemic reached Venezuela. Given all of the conditions of the country, of course, we are just getting into the exponential phase, as it's known. So first, it's a lack of connectivity in the country, and then you look at mobility. It's very difficult for people in a region to use public transportation to move to other areas of the country. In this context, there is an important contingency that is the scarcity of gasoline. Maduro noted that he is going to drop a contingency plan looking at fuel. I'm not sure if you'll recall that in Venezuela, gasoline was so cheap that it was practically gifted to you. It cost less to fill a tank of gas than it did to buy a half a liter of water. So there are matters of scarcity now, and the sanctions, according to Maduro, are preventing imports, but the oil industry has deteriorated so much that it cannot meet supply. How does this have an impact on the pandemic? Or how is the pandemic impacting this? So you'll see a parent starting to experience COVID systems, and the family will bring that person to a private clinic, but there are lots of threats of lockdown by the government or quarantine for those who have symptoms, and they detect it because there are no tests, there's no capacity to do tests, but they'll do x-rays and they say, okay, you have COVID. They start to administer treatment, and the entire family starts to experience the symptoms as well. It is impossible for these individuals in 2 weeks to go see a doctor because there's no gasoline. One member of the family would have to go out to try to find it. And of course, there's no medicine. It's all on the black market. If you start to look at Twitter on the hashtag Servicio Público, what you'll find are requests that people are making 24/7 in Venezuela to come up with money to address the public health crisis. There was a recent report that showed how the design of these centers in practice show the inequality that is, the distances that people have to traverse if they're experiencing respiratory system can exceed 10 kilometers. There are studies, this report that comes from Pro Da Vinci, a media outlet, there are studies that reveal how distance from a hospital is having an impact on mortality rates. This is the context of Venezuela to such a degree that humanitarian organizations are requesting that UNICEF come in with this entire infrastructure to address an ever worsening system. Because in a recent report from the Academy of Sciences calculates that from here to December, there could be up to 14,000 daily cases, new cases of coronavirus. And something else that we see in Venezuela is how opaque information is. And this makes it very difficult for communities to take control. In the countries that spoke before me, there are generally daily reports, whether in Mexico, Brazil, even in Chile. And so you have authorized spokespersons from the government who say, okay, here are the rates. In Venezuela, we have journalists out there trying to find the information. And they've had turnover in all of the official members of the administration. And we all know in our countries, there's underreporting in Venezuela and other countries. In Venezuela, it's bi-weekly that you get it. And every evening, people have to be seeking out the data themselves, going into media that have databases where you have the official data and the reporting, then start basing on models and indication of how the pandemic is progressing. So this is where we are, and we're at the most critical stage of the pandemic right now. It will be much more critical in December. What's going to happen then? Well, based on what Maduro said, they're going to be parliamentary elections on December 6th. And this is going to open up the Pandora's box about democratic forces. And here I'm not talking about opposition. I talk about democratic forces because the government of Venezuela is authoritarian. It checks off all of the boxes of what an authoritarian government is. And we know that there's this possibility they're going to hold these parliamentary elections. And what this means is that the only legitimate branch of government right now may be affected and they may lose power. And so, of course, we know nothing is easy in Venezuela. So the democratic forces are now divided. So it's not just anti-Maduro, there's an internal discussion, and there are two pathways, two different possibilities. One worse than the other, depending on your perspective. But we do not yet know what a real option that would lead to greater democratization of the country. So is it electing Guaido, the interim president who's been recognized by more than 40 countries globally? And the other is a possibility that one of the members of this democratic forces who's used to be a governor is proposing. So they're both are looking to see if there are any traps that would leave Maduro in power. So Venezuelans are so focused on solving the day-to-day crises, So the idea of taking part of elections that are going to be held in the midst of the pandemic are rather low. A July report said that about 40 to 45% of people said that they might participate, they might cast a vote. And if that was only if Guaido and the leadership of the National Assembly were involved. But if that were true, there would be even lower participation, bearing in mind that these parliamentary elections, as we're seeing throughout the region, tend to not have as many people casting votes, especially if people have difficulties moving around because of a scarcity of gasoline and difficulties in public transportation. And then you look at the candidates, there's information that's public, that it's very difficult, that there is a voting system that could be automatic. Just a few months ago, some voting machines were burned. There's a new company. And in the midst of all of this, we're seeing a rapprochement between Capriles and the Maduro government. And they were able to achieve the release of 8 to 10 people who had been detained. They were political prisoners, and they were being held without being brought to trial. This is building expectations, and we're hoping that conversations can continue under the auspices of the European Union, but this is something that leaves many questions on the table. There are many in the international community looking at what's happening, and there's this vision that's repetitive that there can only be free and fair elections when Maduro is no longer in power, while the European Union's position is that they simply need guarantees for the process. And in that context, maybe the December 6th elections will go forward, or maybe not, but that does not solve the most serious problem of all. What is going to happen on January 5th, 2021, when by the Constitution, the current National Assembly's term officially ends? So associated with Guaido with something administrative where the assembly will state that it's remaining in power, and that's where you're going to see the entire discussion. And I go back to this idea that there are two options. They're not necessarily well fleshed out. There are a lot of conditions, a lot of eventualities, but there is the possibility that Madurismo is going to consolidate for the near future. And I think Venezuela is on the path, I would have said inertia, because as long as Maduro's in power, the deep situation in Venezuela will not be solved. This is the humanitarian emergency. People are continuing to die. There's malnutrition. There's no efficient government or public services, and we're up against persecution for the way we think.
Hemos escuchado 5
Thank you.
presentaciones.
We have heard 5 presentations. They were wonderful. They were excellent. I've learned a lot. I had questions, but I think in the time remaining, I'm going to move over to the MC to see if we have time for at least one question and maybe also an answer. And
we have plenty of questions. Tenemos muchas preguntas que nos han llegado a través de la plataforma. We have
many questions that have come from the platform.
James Borsouth from the US. Llega desde Estados Unidos, de James Borsouth. Dice, there are more women in this panel than there are female presidents in Latin America. How has the lack of representation of women and minorities in political system harmed the response to COVID-19? Post-COVID, we will see more or less representative political systems in the election in 2021 and 2022? Si quieres la traduzco, Michael. James Warsaw.
I can translate it. James from the United States was saying that there are more women on the panel than presidents in Latin America. How is this lack of female and minority representation in politics undermined countries' responses to COVID-19? After the pandemic, will we see more or less representation of women and minorities in these systems?
Muy bien, muchas gracias. No sé si
Thank
Lucía
you.
quieres comentar. Y después,
Lucia,
si hay otros
perhaps
que
you
quieren
would
comentar,
like to
responder.
respond. And then others, sure. There's very little time left. And I want to be fair to my colleagues. I'm going to say three things. Latin America is facing a institutionalized patriarchy, and other countries are the same. Most women involved in politics have had to accept a secondary role, not because they wanted to, but that's because it was only a thing available. And the pandemic has showed that domestic violence has increased, that women are leaving their jobs more than men, that women have far more difficulties in publishing papers in academic journals, and there's a problem of illegal and even informal labor. I don't see any chance for opening unless we're able to win more space. We need more women in power, but the new generation is a generation that is more empowered and that has a much more cross-cutting feminist agenda than what existed during my generation. So
Muy
I'm
bien.
very optimistic.
¿Otro quiere comentar?
Great, thank
Mónica,
you.
Luz o
Monica,
otra persona?
Luz. And would anyone else like to comment? Luz, perhaps? Thank you. I completely agree with what Lucia said. I think we also need to see, as far as migrants are concerned, and that's something that we haven't touched on, women are the most impacted. They're the ones migrating and they're the most impacted. So this entire process that we're seeing hemisphere-wide, both in the north and the south, which is being is stretched as if it were two different arms moving in different directions, is going to have an impact. And in this case, if you allow me, for the December 6th elections in Venezuela, the migrant population has no way whatsoever of casting a vote. There's no way of them to do so from
Mónica, ¿tú
abroad.
querías agregar algo?
Monica,
Sí,
would you like to add
bueno,
anything?
haciendo foro
Yes.
ahí con Lucía, con
I
Luz,
too would like to second
estoy
what
totalmente de
both
acuerdo
Luz
con todo lo que se ha
and
dicho.
Lucia were
Y
saying.
en Brasil en
I
especial,
completely
pero
agree with
es
what they
así en
said in
toda la
Brazil
región.
especially,
En
but
este
the
gobierno
truth
de
is
ahora,
it's
el
the same
gobierno de
region-wide.
Bolsonaro
With our
es un
current
gobierno de patriarcado.
administration, the Bolsonaro
La manera como la
administration,
mujer
it is
es
completely
vista
patriarchal.
y está
The
siendo
way women
vista
are
por el
seen and
gobierno
are
con
being
algunos
seen by the
reflejos en la
government
sociedad
with
es
some
una manera que
spillover into society
no da ningún alento acerca de cómo
is
las cosas
something
van a
that
evoluir de acá
is not at all
para el futuro.
encouraging as
Entonces,
we
tenemos
look
ahí
to the
sí un
future.
problema serio de
There is a
inclusión y es
very
de inclusión
serious
en todo.
matter
Es
of
de inclusión
inclusion and
política, es
inclusion
de
in
inclusión en la
everything. That is in
economía. Es
politics,
como decía
in the
Lucía,
economy.
las
It's
mujeres
like what
son las que
Lucia
han
was
sufrido
saying.
más
Women are the ones who
en la
have
epidemia por
borne the
razones,
brunt of the
muchísimas
epidemic
razones,
for
razones que
many
tienen que ver
reasons,
con su
reasons
papel,
that
su
have to
papel
do with
como jefes de
their
familia en
role
muchos casos,
as heads
y
of
con
family in many cases,
los niños en casa y también
and
con
with
los
children at
más idosos
home,
que tienen que cuidar. Entonces son las
and
mujeres que cuidan
the
y son las
people who they
mujeres
need
que
to care for.
entonces
It's always
están
women who
teniendo
do this.
un onus, un
So
peso
the
mayor en
burden
lo que tienen
is
que
much
hacer.
greater on
No veo
them as far as what they need to do.
muchas posibilidades
I
de
don't
mejoras,
see
al menos no en el futuro
many
inmediato, quizá
possible
más
improvements,
adelante,
at
porque
least
sí, como
in
decía
the
Lucía,
immediate
hay una
future,
generación
perhaps
nueva en la
further down the
política en
road.
Brasil,
As Lucia was
eso se
saying,
ve.
There's a
Hay un
new
montón de nuevos
generation, and we see that in
parlamentares
Brazil.
que
We're
son
seeing
progresistas, que tienen
new
visiones
progressive
completamente
members of
diferentes, muy
parliament who have
jóvenes, y
completely different
entonces
visions.
por
They're
la
very
delante
young.
quizá
So
habrá
perhaps
una
looking
mejora. La
forward, we will see
falta
improvements.
o la
A
ausencia
lack or the
de otras
absence
personas, y
of
aquí hablo de
other
minorías,
people,
entonces
and I'm
de la
talking about
gente de
minorities here.
descendencia afro en Brasil,
So
también no hay representación en el
Afro
Congreso,
descendants in Brazil,
casi
there
ninguna.
is almost
Hay
no
ahora en
representation
Brasil
whatsoever in the parliament.
todo un
Now in
movimiento
Brazil, there is
para
an entire
pensar
movement
en cuestiones relativas a
to
racismo
think
y al
about
racismo
things
estructural
having
que
to
ha
do with
siempre marcado la
racism,
sociedad
structural
brasileña
racism
y que ha
that
marcado
has
muchísimo la
always been a
economía y
part of
cómo el
Brazilian
sistema
society,
económico
especially
funciona.
the economy.
Entonces, este debate está muchísimo
This
rico,
debate
pero no se sabe
is out there,
cómo
but we
eso
do
va a
not know
cambiar las
exactly
cosas,
how this is
eso
going to
pasa.
change
Y
things in
sí,
the
la
end.
ausencia de mujeres, de otras
But
minorías,
yes,
de otras
the
personas
lack of
en
women
la
and
política,
minorities
sí, ha
in
hecho muy mal en
politics,
términos de
yes,
respuesta a la
has
pandemia y de respuesta
truly
en
undermined the
términos de
response to
política
the pandemic,
económica. Nosotros no
especially in terms of
deberíamos ser un
economic policy.
patriarcado,
We
esto es
should
una
not be a
cosa del
patriarchal
pasado,
society.
pero
That is
estamos en esta
something that should be
situación.
relegated to the
Muy
past,
bien,
but
muchas
that's the
gracias.
situation.
Voy a pedir
Great.
a Kevin y a
I'm
Jorge
going
si
to
quieren
ask
agregar algo, pero
Kevin and
muy breve porque
Jorge if
ya
they want
se
to
acabó
add
el
something,
tiempo,
but please
pero
be brief
Kevin y
because our
Jorge
time is up.
también, si tiene algo
Kevin
para
and
agregar.
Jorge, if
Muy
there's
breve, por
anything
favor.
you'd like to add.
Kevin.
Michael, of course, the lack of women presidents is a huge problem for so many reasons, and political parties have a great responsibility there. But in my case, I am far more concerned about the effect of the exclusion of women in terms of the weakness and parties that deserve that in the past. We have strong men or business people, and these people are never women. Despite the fact that political parties are even more machista than the average institution, the structure is simply a desert for women. A party might impose representation quotas, and women may be able to reach elected office, but that is not the same in terms of independent candidates. That's why there's not a single woman president in Latin America. The party system in Latin America is basically
Jorge,
a path
te doy la
that
última
is,
palabra, si
it is
quiere
drenched in
agregar algo.
testosterone. Jorge?
Mute.
I believe you're still on mute. I don't know if Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner could be a strong woman, caudilla, as it were, but I do think there has to be some type of proactive or affirmative action, whatever you want to call it, above all in the case of Afro descendants in many countries in Latin America, of course, beginning with Brazil and countries of the Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, which are in a very unfortunate situation. And even if we look at the United States, which let's just say has not set the bar very high. Thank you, Jorge, and I apologize for exceeding our time. I think it was a very rich discussion.
A Kevin, a Mónica,
and
Jorge,
thank you, Kevin, Monica,
Lucia
Jorge,
y Luz.
Lucia, and Luz. You were all extraordinary. And on behalf of the dialogue and the CAF, thank you very much. And with that, we will go back to Gustavo. Gustavo?
Thank you. We'll be back shortly for the second and last panel of the day.